tormenta de nieve lo llevó a una cueva, una viuda apache que jamás imaginó. Amid this unforgiving landscape, a man moved cautiously, his boots sinking into the thick snow with each step. His face was pale from the cold, and he shivered beneath the layers of clothing he had packed. He had been traveling for days, following a narrow path through the mountains, hoping to reach the valley below before nightfall. But the mountains had other plans. He had always loved the mountains. Their beauty, their quiet majesty, and the way they demanded respect drew him in. Yet he had never faced a storm like this. The wind was sharp, carrying the bitter chill deep into his bones. Every step felt like a struggle, every breath like inhaling ice. His hands were numb despite his gloves, and his face ached from the cold. The snow had been falling lightly when he first set out in the morning, but now it was relentless, whipping across the slopes with an almost angry intensity. He paused, leaning on his walking stick, trying to gauge the best way forward. Visibility was near zero, and the path he had been following seemed to vanish under a blanket of snow. He could hear the wind tearing across the cliffs, making the rocks groan under its pressure. Panic began to creep into his mind. Alone, with no shelter in sight and miles from the nearest village, he realized how vulnerable he truly was. He had underestimated the mountains, believing his experience as a traveler would carry him through. But nature was unpredictable, and tonight it was ruthless. As he stumbled through the snow, he thought about turning back, but retracing his steps was nearly impossible. The wind had erased all signs of the trail. He moved slowly, carefully testing the ground ahead with his stick. Rocks hidden under the snow could break his leg, and deep patches of ice could send him sliding into dangerous slopes. His thoughts raced, yet he tried to remain calm. Panic could be deadly here. The cold gnawed at his determination, and he could feel his energy fading with each step. Then, faintly through the blizzard, he noticed a dark shape against the white. At first, he thought it was a shadow cast by a rock formation, but as he got closer, he realized it was a cave. The entrance was small, almost hidden by snow, but it offered shelter from the storm. Relief surged through him, warming him slightly despite the cold. He hurried toward it, slipping and sliding, his heart pounding with both fear and hope. The cave was not grand or inviting, but in that moment it was a lifeline. As he reached the entrance, he paused to catch his breath and assess the space. The mouth of the cave was narrow, just wide enough for him to crawl inside. Snow clung to the edges and the wind howled around it, but inside there was silence. Tentatively, he stepped in. The air was damp and cold, but it was protected from the biting wind. He took off his snow-covered jacket, shaking it free of ice and snow, and tried to warm his hands by rubbing them together. He could feel the frostbite slowly creeping into his fingers, and he knew he needed to act quickly if he wanted to survive. The cave was small, just enough space for a single person to sit and stretch out. He inspected it carefully, looking for signs of danger. There were rocks and some dried moss on the floor, but nothing threatening. As he settled in, he noticed the faint smell of smoke mixed with earth. He froze for a moment, unsure whether this meant someone was already there. The thought of encountering a stranger in such a confined space made him nervous. He had heard stories of people living in isolation in the mountains, some kind, some not, but there was no way to know what he might find. Summoning his courage, he ventured further into the cave. He moved slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the entrance. And then he saw it, a small fire pit, long unused but still intact, surrounded by carefully stacked stones. Near it there were blankets and a few containers, possibly for food or water. Someone had been here before. His heart raced with curiosity and caution. Who could be living in such a remote place? Was it dangerous? Or could it be a chance for help and survival? He knelt near the fire pit, examining it carefully. The stones were arranged in a way that suggested someone knew how to manage a fire even in harsh conditions. The blankets looked old but well kept, and the containers seemed practical, not decorative. Whoever had been here was resourceful, someone accustomed to life in the mountains. He wondered how long they had been living here alone and what stories they carried with them. Just as he was about to move further in, he heard a soft sound, a shuffle almost imperceptible over the wind. He froze. His mind raced. Perhaps it was the wind, or maybe an animal. But then he saw a figure emerging from a darker corner of the cave. A woman older than him, with weathered skin and sharp eyes, looked at him carefully. She carried herself with quiet confidence, a presence that was both cautious and commanding. He could see that she was strong, someone who had survived challenges he could barely imagine. The woman studied him as if trying to decide whether he was friend or threat. There was a long pause, filled with the sound of the storm outside. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace. I'm just seeking shelter from the storm," he said, his voice trembling from both cold and fear. She did not respond immediately, but the intensity of her gaze softened slightly. After a moment, she nodded and gestured for him to sit near the far edge of the cave. Relief washed over him, mixed with awe. He had expected danger, but instead, he found someone who seemed willing to help. As he settled, she moved toward the back of the cave, returning with a small bundle of blankets and a flask of water. She handed them to him without a word, her movements precise and deliberate. He thanked her quietly, trying to hide his amazement. Her presence was both comforting and mysterious. As he wrapped himself in the blankets, he noticed the lines on her face, the strength in her hands, and the calmness in her eyes. She had lived through hardships, and her resilience was evident. The snowstorm outside continued to rage, but inside the cave, there was a fragile sense of safety. He realized that this unexpected encounter might be more than just survival. It might be a lesson in human connection, resilience, and trust. Hours passed as they sat in silence, the storm howling outside and the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. He learned to observe her carefully, the way she moved, the way she prepared small pieces of food for him, and the quiet way she ensured his comfort without intrusion. He felt a strange mix of gratitude and curiosity. Who was she? How had she ended up in this remote cave? And what stories did the mountains hold for someone who had chosen solitude over the world? By the time the storm began to ease, he realized he had survived not only because of the cave, but because of this woman who had silently welcomed him. The snow outside remained deep, but the danger felt less pressing now. He had found shelter, warmth, and something more, an encounter that he would never forget. The mountains were harsh and unforgiving, yet they had led him here, to a place he never would have imagined, and to a person whose life story seemed as extraordinary as the landscape itself. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe freely. He knew the journey was far from over, but for tonight, he was safe. And in that moment, as he watched the firelight dance on the cave walls and the snow swirl outside, he realized that the storm had done more than force him into shelter. It had led him to a connection he never expected, a meeting that would change the course of his life in ways he could not yet understand. The snowstorm outside raged on through the night, but inside the cave, a fragile warmth lingered. The man, still wrapped in blankets, watched the woman move with quiet efficiency. She carried a small bundle of firewood and carefully placed it near the pit, feeding the embers so that the fire would burn steadily. Her hands were skilled, each movement deliberate and confident, revealing a life shaped by necessity and experience. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that danced across the cave walls, and in that light, the man began to notice more details about her. She was of medium height, with dark hair streaked with gray, pulled back neatly. Her eyes were sharp, alert, and filled with a quiet strength that made it clear she was accustomed to living alone in the mountains. There was a calmness about her, but also a hint of sadness that seemed to linger beneath her composed exterior. The man wondered about her story. How had she ended up here in such isolation? What experiences had made her so self-reliant, so unafraid of the harsh elements surrounding them? For his part, he wanted to speak, to ask questions, to understand the person who had saved him from the storm. But there was a hesitation, a sense that he should wait until she was ready to share. Instead, he observed quietly, learning through her actions. She set a small bowl near the fire and placed a simple meal inside: dried meat, bread, and a few roots she must have foraged. He understood that this was not a casual act. It was a careful, thoughtful gesture of kindness, given without expectation. He nodded in thanks, his voice still hoarse from the cold. As he ate, he noticed that she watched him closely but not intrusively. It was as if she was assessing his character, trying to understand who he was and whether he could be trusted. The man appreciated this cautious approach. It showed experience, wisdom, and a survival instinct honed by years alone in the wilderness. Over time, he realized that she had likely faced many challenges that tested her courage and skill. Her quiet strength reminded him that survival was not just about physical endurance, but also about mental resilience and awareness. After they had eaten, the man decided to speak. I'm grateful for your help," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't expect to find anyone here." She did not respond immediately, but her eyes softened slightly. "The mountains are harsh," she said finally. "They take care of those who respect them, and sometimes they bring people together in unexpected ways." Her voice was calm, measured, and carried the weight of experience. He listened intently, realizing that there was much more beneath her words than he could yet understand. Over the next few hours, they began to exchange small details about themselves. He learned that she had been living in the cave for many years, after losing her husband in a conflict long ago. She had chosen solitude not out of fear, but because it allowed her to live in harmony with the mountains and the wildlife. Her days were filled with foraging, hunting, and maintaining her shelter. She spoke of the seasons, the way animals behaved, and how the land provided for those who understood it. The man listened, fascinated by her knowledge and her connection to the natural world. In return, he shared some of his own story. He spoke of his travels, his love for the mountains, and his experiences navigating difficult terrain. He told her about the journey that had brought him here, and the mistakes he had made in underestimating the storm. She listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, and he realized that this was the first time he had spoken so openly with anyone about his vulnerabilities. There was a trust forming, slowly, silently, built on shared experience and mutual respect. As the storm continued outside, the hours passed quickly. They worked together in simple tasks, gathering small pieces of wood, maintaining the fire, and arranging blankets and supplies to ensure comfort. In these moments, the man began to notice the subtle lessons in her actions. How she conserved energy, how she used every resource wisely, and how she remained calm even in extreme conditions. It was a different kind of survival, one that combined patience, intelligence, and observation. He realized that these skills could be as vital as strength or speed in the wilderness. The woman, in turn, began to observe him more closely. She noticed his determination, his ability to remain calm despite fear, and his willingness to learn. He asked questions, watched her techniques, and listened carefully to her instructions. She saw in him a sincerity and respect that was rare among visitors, and slowly, a quiet trust began to form. In her eyes, he was not just a stranger, but someone capable of understanding the challenges of mountain life and the wisdom it required. By nightfall, the snowstorm had reached its peak. The wind shook the cave entrance, and snow drifts piled against the rocks. Yet inside there was warmth, both from the fire and from the growing bond between them. The man felt a sense of gratitude that went beyond mere survival. He had entered the cave alone, frightened and uncertain, and now he was part of a small, fragile partnership. It was a connection formed not by choice, but by circumstance, a reminder that even in isolation, humans were not meant to endure life completely alone. As they settled near the fire, the woman began to speak of her past in greater detail. She recounted memories of her husband, the early years of their life together, and the events that had led her to seek solitude. She spoke without bitterness, instead emphasizing the lessons she had learned: resilience, patience, and the ability to find peace in one's own company. The man listened, captivated by her strength and the clarity of her mind. He realized that her solitude had not hardened her, it had shaped her, allowing her to survive and thrive where others might have faltered. The night grew colder, and the storm showed no sign of easing. The man felt a deep sense of humility, recognizing that his survival depended not only on his own skills, but also on the kindness and wisdom of this remarkable woman. He thought about the path that had led him here, the choices he had made, and the unpredictability of nature. The mountains, he understood now, were not just obstacles, they were teachers, shaping those who dared to traverse them. By early morning, the storm began to wane, and the first light of day crept over the snow-covered peaks. Inside the cave, the fire still burned, and the two shared a quiet breakfast. There was a sense of routine, of shared understanding, and an unspoken acknowledgement that their encounter had changed something in both of them. The man felt stronger, wiser, and more aware of the delicate balance between nature and human life. The woman, in turn, seemed lighter, as if sharing her story had eased some of the weight she carried. Before he left the warmth of the fire to explore the cave further, he asked a simple question. "Do you ever feel lonely here?" She paused, considering her answer. "Sometimes," she said finally, "but the mountains are never truly empty. They teach, challenge, and surprise you. And sometimes people appear when you least expect it." He nodded, understanding that their meeting was one of those rare surprises. He realized that life, like the mountains, was unpredictable, and that unexpected encounters could leave lasting impressions. As the day progressed, he explored the small cave further, discovering small details that spoke of a life lived with care and thought. There were handmade tools, containers for storing food, and careful arrangements for sleeping and sheltering from the elements. Each item told a story of resilience and adaptability, and he felt both admiration and curiosity. This was not just a place of survival, it was a home, created through ingenuity, patience, and deep knowledge of the natural world. By the end of the day, the man understood that this encounter would remain with him long after he left the cave. The woman had shared not just her shelter, but her life lessons, her knowledge, and a glimpse into a way of living that balanced survival with respect for nature. The snowstorm that had seemed so threatening at first had led him to this extraordinary meeting, teaching him that even in the harshest conditions, kindness, wisdom, and human connection could prevail. Days passed in the cave as the storm outside slowly subsided, leaving the mountains covered in thick, sparkling snow. The man and the woman settled into a quiet rhythm, working together to maintain the fire, gather wood, and prepare simple meals. With each passing day, the man learned more about the wilderness and the woman's careful ways of living. She showed him how to track animal footprints in the snow, how to recognize edible plants, and how to use the landscape to stay warm and safe. Her knowledge was practical and precise, but it also carried a deep understanding of life, patience, and survival. At first, he had simply followed her instructions, careful not to interfere. But gradually, he began to ask questions, seeking to understand the reasons behind her methods. She answered patiently, explaining how the seasons affected food sources, how certain winds signaled weather changes, and how even the smallest details, like the placement of stones around a fire, could make the difference between warmth and frostbite. Every lesson she shared made him more aware of the environment, and he began to respect the mountains not just as obstacles, but as living forces with their own rules. The man also learned about the woman herself. She spoke of her past with a mixture of sorrow and pride. She told him how she had lost her husband many years ago and how, at first, the loneliness had been unbearable. But the mountains had become her teacher. She had learned patience, resilience, and the quiet strength to face every challenge alone. Her stories were filled with vivid memories, times of scarcity when she had relied on ingenuity to survive, moments of fear during harsh storms, and small triumphs when she had mastered a new skill. The man listened closely, fascinated not only by her experiences but by her calm and confident way of sharing them. As they spent more time together, a subtle bond began to form. It was not friendship in the ordinary sense, nor romance, but a connection built on mutual respect, shared survival, and the acknowledgement of each other's strengths. The woman began to see his determination, patience, and willingness to learn as signs of character. The man, in turn, admired her resilience, wisdom, and quiet courage. Together, they became a team, relying on one another in small but meaningful ways, like stacking firewood efficiently, scouting the surroundings for danger, or deciding which food to ration during the colder days. One afternoon, as the sun broke through the clouds, the man noticed that the snow had piled deep around the cave entrance, making it nearly impossible to leave without effort. He realized that the storm had left a landscape transformed, beautiful but dangerous. The woman, seeing his concern, smiled softly. "The mountains can be frightening," she said, "but they are also honest. They show you what you need to see. Today, the snow is high and the journey is difficult, but it is not impossible. You have to respect it, not fear it." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. They were a reminder that survival was not just about strength, but about understanding and cooperation. That evening, while the fire crackled, the woman began teaching him more subtle skills. She showed him how to create small traps for animals, how to conserve energy during harsh weather, and how to recognize patterns in the wind and clouds that predicted storms. He struggled at first, fumbling with the techniques, but she encouraged him gently, correcting his mistakes with patience rather than criticism. He realized that every skill she taught was rooted in experience, wisdom, and respect for life itself. He was learning not just to survive, but to thrive in a world that demanded both caution and courage. Their conversations grew deeper as well. The man spoke of his life outside the mountains, the people he had known, and the ambitions that had driven him to travel. The woman listened with interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed her curiosity and intelligence. She shared her reflections on life, emphasizing the importance of balance, resilience, and humility. They discussed human nature, the meaning of courage, and the ways in which hardship could reveal true character. Through these talks, the man realized that he was gaining more than survival skills. He was gaining perspective, patience, and a deeper understanding of life itself. One evening, a small crisis tested their trust and cooperation. While checking the cave's perimeter, the man spotted a wild animal, a mountain wolf, approaching from the ridge. It was cautious but clearly interested in their presence. The man froze, unsure what to do. The woman quickly assessed the situation, whispering instructions for him to remain calm, move slowly, and keep the fire as a protective barrier. Together, they managed to scare the animal away without harm, relying on their combined knowledge and careful coordination. That night, as they reflected on the encounter, the man realized the importance of their teamwork. He saw that survival depended not just on individual skill, but on trust, communication, and mutual respect. Over the following days, they continued to work together, and their bond strengthened further. The man began to anticipate her instructions, learning to read her subtle signals and the rhythm of her actions. They shared quiet moments of observation, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered peaks or listening to the soft rush of wind through the trees. These moments were peaceful yet powerful, a reminder that even in isolation, life could offer beauty, connection, and learning. During one particularly quiet evening, the woman shared a story from her youth. She spoke of a time when her husband had taken her into the mountains, teaching her basic survival skills. She recounted both the joy and the hardships of those days, the lessons learned from nature, and the sense of independence she had developed after his passing. Her story was both moving and inspiring. The man realized that her strength was not just physical but emotional, born from years of facing loss, danger, and solitude. He felt both admiration and humility, understanding how much he had to learn from her beyond the practical skills of survival. As the storm finally moved away and the snow began to melt slightly in the sunlight, the man felt a growing sense of gratitude. He had entered the mountains alone, expecting only a difficult journey, and had instead found shelter, guidance, and a remarkable human connection. He realized that the woman's life lessons, resilience, patience, respect for nature, and the importance of trust, were gifts that would stay with him forever. She had not only kept him safe from the storm, but had also opened his mind to new ways of seeing and understanding the world. One afternoon, he ventured slightly beyond the cave with her guidance, testing the snow-packed paths under her careful watch. She taught him to balance his weight on hidden ice, to recognize subtle shifts in the snow that indicated danger, and to use natural landmarks to navigate. The man moved cautiously, but with increasing confidence. Each step reinforced his respect for the mountains and for the wisdom of the woman who had saved him. He began to feel a deeper connection not only to the landscape, but also to the person who had shared her knowledge so generously. By the end of the week, the man and the woman had settled into a routine of survival, learning, and quiet companionship. Their bond was no longer tentative. It was a partnership rooted in respect, trust, and shared experience. The man understood that he had been changed by this encounter. He was stronger, more aware, and more patient. The woman, in turn, seemed to carry a lighter spirit, having shared her skills, stories, and company with someone who genuinely appreciated them. One night, as they sat near the fire, the man reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had led him here. The snowstorm that had seemed like a threat had instead brought him to a remarkable human connection, teaching him lessons about resilience, kindness, and the unpredictable ways in which life could lead someone to safety and growth. The mountains, once feared, had become a place of learning, reflection, and transformation. He realized that survival was not just about enduring the elements, but about learning to navigate both nature and human connection with patience, humility, and trust. The days following the storm brought a mixture of calm and subtle tension. The mountains were quiet, almost serene, but the man and the woman both knew that nature could be unpredictable. The snow had settled into deep drifts, and while the immediate danger of the storm had passed, other challenges were beginning to show themselves. Small avalanches had altered the familiar paths, and the icy streams made travel tricky. Yet, it was not just the environment that tested them. Unexpected events and personal discoveries were beginning to shape their experience together. One morning, as the man ventured near the cave entrance to gather firewood, he noticed signs of wildlife in the snow. Tracks led in several directions, indicating that animals were active despite the harsh winter. The woman appeared beside him silently, pointing out subtle signs that he might have missed. "See these marks," she said softly. "A fox passed here last night, and here the snow is softer, probably where a deer rested. Pay attention to the details. They tell stories." He realized that she could read the mountains like a book, noticing everything, from the smallest footprints to the movement of clouds. He admired her skills and understood that these lessons were far more valuable than any map or compass could offer. That afternoon, a more immediate challenge arose. As they explored a nearby slope for additional firewood, a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the mountains. The man froze, recognizing the sound of ice shifting, a possible avalanche. Snow began to tumble down the mountainside in a low roar, sending clouds of powder into the air. Panic surged through him, but the woman acted quickly, pulling him toward a safer area behind large boulders. She remained calm, her movements precise and sure. "Stay close to me," she said, her voice steady. "Keep your weight low and move carefully. Watch where the snow is loose." Together, they waited as the avalanche passed, the roar fading into silence. The man felt his heart pounding, grateful for her experience and composure. After the danger had passed, they paused to catch their breath. The man was shaken but also amazed. "How do you stay so calm?" he asked. She smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and strength. "Experience teaches you," she said. "Fear can be useful, it tells you to pay attention, but panic is dangerous. The mountains respect those who respect them, and they punish those who are careless." He realized that her calmness was not born of indifference, but of wisdom gained through countless trials. Every decision she made was deliberate, informed by knowledge and careful observation. The events of that day brought a new awareness between them. The man began to anticipate her instructions, learning to recognize subtle signs in the environment, shifts in wind, the sound of cracking ice, the patterns in the snow. He began to understand that survival was not just about strength, but about observation, timing, and trust. He also began to see the woman in a new light, not only as a guide or teacher, but as someone who had endured immense personal loss and yet found ways to thrive despite it. Her resilience inspired him, and he felt both admiration and a desire to learn more from her experiences. Over the next few days, they faced additional challenges that tested their cooperation and resourcefulness. A sudden thaw caused the nearby stream to swell, creating a small flood that threatened to wash away their carefully stored supplies. Together, they worked to move their provisions to higher ground, improvising with rocks and branches to secure everything. The man realized that he had begun to think more like the woman, assessing risks, planning ahead, and acting with caution and efficiency. Their teamwork had grown stronger, and he appreciated the silent understanding that had developed between them. One evening, after the physical challenges of the day, the conversation turned to life beyond the mountains. The woman spoke of the people she had known before choosing solitude, sharing memories of family, friends, and her husband. Her stories were filled with emotion, yet she spoke without bitterness, emphasizing the lessons she had learned rather than dwelling on loss. She spoke of love, patience, and the importance of understanding the world around her. The man listened intently, absorbing not just the facts, but the wisdom embedded in her reflections. As the days passed, the man began to reflect on his own life and choices. He realized that the mountains had forced him to confront not just the external challenges of survival, but also his internal fears and doubts. He saw how much he relied on his own abilities, yet also how essential it was to trust others and accept help when needed. The woman's presence had taught him patience, humility, and the value of careful observation. He felt a growing sense of gratitude, not just for her guidance, but for the lessons the mountains themselves offered. A turning point came when they discovered a small, injured bird near the cave. The bird had fallen from its nest, unable to fly. The man instinctively wanted to leave it behind, thinking it would not survive the harsh conditions. But the woman intervened, gently taking the bird and showing him how to care for it. They fed it, kept it warm near the fire, and watched over it carefully. Over the next days, the bird regained strength, eventually taking flight once more. The man realized that this small act reflected much of what he had learned from the woman: attention to detail, patience, compassion, and the understanding that even the smallest life could teach important lessons. Their partnership also faced emotional challenges. The man noticed that the woman sometimes seemed distant, lost in thought. One evening, he asked her gently about it. She admitted that memories of her past occasionally surfaced, especially when she was reminded of her husband and the life she had left behind. She spoke of the pain and loneliness she had endured, but also of the strength she had gained. The man listened quietly, understanding that her solitude had not been a punishment but a choice, a way to connect with life and nature on her own terms. He respected her deeply for her honesty and courage. One particularly harsh night brought another test. A sudden snowstorm returned, even fiercer than the previous one. Visibility dropped to almost zero, and the wind howled with a ferocity that rattled the cave walls. They worked together to secure the entrance, adding rocks and snow to block the gusts and protect their fire. The man felt fear rising again, but the woman's calm presence reminded him to focus on practical action. "Panic will only make it worse," she said quietly. "Do what you can and the rest will follow." Her words were simple, yet powerful, and they guided him through the long, cold night. By morning, the storm had passed once again, leaving a landscape blanketed in sparkling snow. The man and the woman stepped outside, surveying the transformed mountains. Despite the challenges they had faced, both felt a sense of accomplishment and growth. They had relied on one another, shared knowledge and skills, and discovered strengths they had not known they possessed. The man realized that he had changed in profound ways. He was more patient, more aware, and more attuned to both nature and human connection. The woman, too, seemed lighter, as if sharing her life and wisdom had eased some of the weight she carried. In the quiet moments after the storm, they reflected on their journey so far. The man recognized that the mountains had tested them in ways that went beyond physical survival. They had confronted fear, uncertainty, and the unpredictability of life. But they had also discovered courage, resilience, and the importance of trust and companionship. Each challenge had strengthened their bond, teaching them that human connection could be as vital to survival as knowledge of the land. The man also realized that he had come to value not only the woman's skills but her perspective on life. She had shown him that survival was not merely about enduring hardships, but about understanding, learning, and adapting. He understood that life was unpredictable, full of unexpected challenges and lessons, and that it was essential to remain open, patient, and attentive. The woman's example had taught him that wisdom often came from experience, reflection, and respect for the world around him. By the end of Part 4, both felt a sense of readiness. The mountains had tested them, but they had also revealed their strengths. The man had grown in confidence and knowledge, while the woman had shared her wisdom and found a companion in the isolation. The events of the past days had left an impression on both of them, shaping their understanding of life, resilience, and human connection. They knew that challenges would continue, but they were prepared to face them together, guided by trust, experience, and the lessons the mountains had taught them. The days in the mountains had passed quickly, though each felt long with effort, learning, and quiet reflection. The man had grown stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the rhythms of nature. He had learned skills that went beyond mere survival: patience, observation, trust, and the understanding that life's challenges often brought unexpected lessons. Yet he knew that he could not remain in the cave forever. The mountains had been a teacher, but the world beyond called him back. The thought of leaving was bittersweet. The woman sensed his thoughts. She watched him as he packed some of his belongings, carefully folding his blankets and arranging his few supplies. She did not speak immediately, understanding that this was a moment both of reflection and quiet preparation. Finally, she said softly, "You have learned much here, but you will carry even more when you leave. Remember what you have seen and do not forget the lessons of the mountains." Her voice carried warmth, but also a gentle sadness. The man nodded, feeling the weight of her words. They spent the morning together, reviewing the skills he had learned. She tested him on identifying safe paths through the snow, on reading subtle changes in the weather, and on recognizing signs of wildlife. He performed carefully, applying the lessons of the past days. She corrected him when necessary, but her tone was encouraging rather than harsh. With each demonstration, he felt a mixture of pride and gratitude. He understood that her guidance had been more than instruction. It had been a gift of experience, patience, and trust. As the sun rose higher in the sky, they decided it was time for him to leave the cave and begin his journey back to the valley. The snow had melted slightly on the paths, though the terrain remained challenging. They walked together to the edge of the ridge, pausing to take in the view of the mountains stretching endlessly into the distance. The man felt a sense of awe and humility. These peaks, which had seemed so threatening when he first arrived, now felt like an old friend, familiar and full of lessons he could carry with him forever. Before stepping onto the path, the man turned to the woman. "I cannot thank you enough," he said, his voice quiet with emotion. "You saved my life, taught me so much, and showed me a way of seeing the world I never imagined." "I will never forget this," she smiled, a faint but genuine expression that reflected pride, warmth, and perhaps a hint of sorrow. "You came here not knowing what the mountains would teach you," she said. "Now you leave with understanding. That is more valuable than any path you could have taken on your own." The journey back down the mountain was slow but steady. The man applied everything he had learned: careful placement of each foot, attention to subtle changes in the snow and terrain, and patience when the path became slippery or uncertain. He noticed small details that previously would have escaped him: the tracks of animals, the way shadows shifted with the sun, and the quiet beauty of frozen streams and snow-laden trees. With each step, he felt both strength and humility, understanding that he was part of a larger world, one that required respect and awareness. Along the way, he reflected on his time in the cave. The woman's lessons had extended beyond survival. He thought about the way she had balanced solitude with reflection, how she had endured loss without bitterness, and how she had shared her knowledge without demanding gratitude. Her life had been shaped by hardship, yet she had found ways to thrive, to live fully, and to impart wisdom to someone who truly valued it. He realized that her presence had changed him, not just his skills, but his perspective, patience, and understanding of human connection. After several hours, the valley below came into view. The landscape shifted from rugged peaks to gentle slopes, and traces of human settlement became visible: farmlands, small cabins, and paths leading to towns. The man felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that he would return to civilization and the comfort it offered, and sadness at leaving a place that had been both a teacher and a sanctuary. The mountains, with their beauty and challenges, had left an indelible mark on him. When they reached the base of the ridge, the woman stopped him. She gestured to the path leading toward the village and said, "This is where we part ways. Remember, the mountains will always be with you in what you have learned. Respect them and they will guide you just as they guided you here." He nodded, feeling emotion well up inside. He had come to respect her wisdom and strength, and he realized that this farewell was more than just leaving a place. It was leaving a chapter of life that had transformed him. He paused for a final look at the cave and the mountains surrounding it. The wind carried a faint whisper of snow, and he imagined the quiet presence of the woman tending to her home. He understood that her life, shaped by solitude and experience, was extraordinary in ways few could comprehend. He took a deep breath, feeling gratitude, awe, and a sense of responsibility. The mountains had given him skills, lessons, and an example of resilience and courage that he would carry with him always. As he began the walk toward the village, he reflected on the transformation within himself. He was no longer the same person who had stumbled into the storm, fearful and uncertain. He had learned to observe, adapt, and survive. He had gained patience, humility, and a deeper understanding of life's unpredictability. Most importantly, he had experienced human connection in a profound way, realizing that trust, respect, and compassion could bridge even the most challenging circumstances. During the descent, he encountered small challenges, slippery rocks, hidden ice, and deep snowdrifts. But each obstacle reminded him of the lessons he had learned in the mountains. He moved carefully, thoughtfully, and confidently, applying skills that once seemed impossible to master. The memory of the woman's guidance accompanied him with every step, a quiet presence reminding him of resilience, patience, and the importance of careful observation. By late afternoon, he reached the first signs of the village, smoke rising from chimneys, the faint sound of livestock, and distant voices of people going about their day. The world outside the mountains seemed both familiar and strange after his time in isolation. He carried himself with a newfound confidence, yet also with humility, recognizing that the lessons of the mountains were not about conquering nature, but about understanding, respecting, and adapting to it. Before entering the village, he paused again, thinking of the woman who had shared her knowledge and her life with him. He silently promised that he would honor her lessons by living with awareness, patience, and respect for both nature and human relationships. He realized that life's greatest teachings often came from unexpected places, and that the mountains and the woman had given him a gift far greater than survival. They had given him insight into life, resilience, and connection. As he stepped into the village, the warmth of the buildings and the friendliness of the people greeted him. Yet, even amid this comfort, his thoughts lingered on the mountains and the cave. He knew that those lessons, experiences, and memories would remain with him forever. He had survived a storm, faced physical and emotional challenges, and gained wisdom and trust that would shape his life in ways he could not yet fully understand. In the following days, he shared some of his experiences with villagers, but he also understood that the true depth of his lessons was private, carried in memory and reflection. The mountains had transformed him, and the woman had guided him in ways that words alone could not capture. He felt a quiet pride in his growth and a deep gratitude for the guidance, trust, and wisdom he had received. The story of his journey, the snowstorm, and the cave became a personal reminder of life's unpredictability, the value of human connection, and the strength that could be found in trust, patience, and resilience. He often thought of the woman, wondering if she was tending to the cave, watching the mountains, and reflecting on her own life. He knew that their paths had crossed for a reason, leaving a lasting impression on both their lives. Ultimately, he understood that the mountains had been more than a place of survival. They had been a classroom, a sanctuary, and a mirror. The woman had not just provided shelter. She had taught him how to face life's storms, both literal and metaphorical. He carried with him a renewed sense of courage, perspective, and respect for the world and the people who inhabit it. The journey had ended, but its lessons would remain, shaping every decision, every step, and every encounter he would face in the years to come. As he walked into the village, feeling the soft warmth of sunlight on his face and the familiar sounds of life around him, he smiled quietly. The snowstorm that had brought him to the mountains, the cave that had offered shelter, and the woman who had shared her knowledge and her strength, all of it had changed him forever. He knew that the world beyond the mountains awaited, but he also knew that he would never forget the lessons learned in solitude, danger, and unexpected connection.